So let's go on to then. We talked about these shifts in perspective, and that we're gonna change our perspective of how we're looking at things. Get out of kind of this narrow to a wider perspective. Get away from the immediate moment to having a more long-term perspective. Even getting away from our sort of self-centered, seeing it only through my own eyes and my own situation, to take on the view of others, to have that empathic connection with others. And I put this together with a couple more things, and maybe there are many other things that are changes in perspective, shifts in perspective, but from our Buddhist practice, I think there are others that can help us deal with difficult times. For example, holding the perspective that people are fundamentally good rather than as bad or evil. That this is, I think, I grew up in the Catholic tradition where it seemed like there was some default that we were all sort of tainted from the beginning through the force of original sin or whatever, but that this is, and even many people in our culture seem to think that people left to their own devices will default to their worst behavior. I mean, there was that film, The Lord of the Flies, what was based on William Golding's book, right? Where, like, if you leave all these kids, young adults on this island, then left to their own devices, they're going to become militaristic and torture each other and kill each other eventually. I mean, it's not a very helpful view in many ways. But Buddhism has this idea rooted in the concept of Buddha nature and the natural purity of the mind, that actually, at our deepest level, there is goodness, because that purity is resonant with all of those qualities. Whereas anger and hatred and all the things that lead to difficulties in the world, those things are antithetical to reality. Those things are not in line with the nature of the mind. That's why they can be removed, is because there's no solid ground for them. We looked at this in the course 2 weeks ago. So I think this is a helpful perspective, so that when we look at even someone who, again, if you are not enamored of Mr. Trump, then you can look at him as an example and see that he's actually got a fundamental goodness to him. He has Buddha nature. He has the potential to change. And at his deepest level, deepest core of his being, is that purity. I mean, I was reminded of this in a story I heard about a Buddhist teacher named Vinnie Ferraro, who I may have shared this here before, but did I tell this story since I've been here?
I didn't.
He, I think, was living in the, he was, as a young adult, he was in, I think it's New Haven, Connecticut. I never realized that there were gangs in Connecticut, but apparently he was part of a gang. I don't know, I've never even been to Connecticut. I just have this view of, like, New England being white picket fences and, who knows what,
Well, there are definitely some of those, too.
Sorry, and those of you listening, that's just my own naivety, but, so, he was in a gang that would actually go out with baseball bats and beat up homeless people. This was like what they did for fun. And the story goes, he's now a Dharma teacher, but the story goes, he was with his gang with this baseball bat, and there was a homeless man who looked up at him before he could swing a blow and said, "Please don't do this to me." Locked eyes with Vinny, and Vinny said, "Why do you think I'm not going to do this to you?" And he said, "Because you have the most compassionate eyes I've ever seen." And Vinny couldn't go through with the act. He just he was able to, through the force of this catalyst. It wasn't that he was able to do this all on his own, but through the force of this catalyst of this homeless person, who knows what that homeless person was, maybe that was a Buddha, hard to tell, but was able to make this connection with him that allowed him to get in touch with that inner goodness, that allowed him to actually express it. Whereas before he was completely armored, incapable of experiencing that. Maybe he had it for a few people in his life, or had it for animals or things like that, pets or whatever that were in his life. But even maybe his buddies in the gang, he might have some care and compassion for them. But he was really just cruel to other people beyond that. But he had the potential to have that awaken, and now he's a Dharma teacher. How amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an amazing story. I mean, this guy tells the story. This is what he says happened. I have no reason to suspect it didn't. But it's a pretty powerful witness, and kind of example of how we each can get in touch with that. So don't dismiss anybody, because people all have that potential. It just takes different causes and conditions. Another perspective that I think is really useful, I mentioned this briefly earlier, is having an optimistic view as opposed to one that is pessimistic. This can develop from remembering that every situation is workable and can change, that this is an experience from which we can learn and grow. You know, I talked about this earlier, and we're going to get into this now. We're moving into the last part of today where we look at the specific advice on finding peace and courage, making our way through difficult times. That we don't know what can come out of this move to this particular direction that many of us feel is not so useful for the country at this time, but, and even for the world at this time, could be a huge factor in creating something that could be magnificent out of this. Again, it involves a bit of that time element as well. But the idea is, in the face of this, should we buy into the pessimism, buy into the negative view of it, or should we actually hold a more optimistic view? I mentioned this earlier. Venerable Rabina once said in one of her teachings, you know, why not be optimistic? Even if you're drowning, why not be optimistic? Mm-hmm. Even if you're, you know, sitting there, all the water's starting to fill up your lungs and you're, you know, going underwater deeper and deeper, why not be optimistic? I mean, does your pessimism at any point really help you in the process? No. So I don't know. I think there is something to be said for the value of optimism in the face of what we're looking at. And we'll see that a bit in terms of how some teachers look at the idea of hope. Hope is not taught that much in Buddhism either, you know, but hope is a really major component of our strong intentions to move in more positive directions. So I don't know if there are other shifts in perspective that any of you have seen that have been useful. Yes, Chuck?
About all sentient beings have been your mother.
Yeah, I think that's a useful one, to generate that compassion. You know, that helps us to understand that sentient beings have been incredibly kind to us in that role. And of course it's based on the idea that they actually have, not just imagining that they have, which is a bit hard to fathom. The idea is that since we've had a mind that goes back without any beginning, we've had infinite rebirths. So we've had various beings playing the role of our mother at various times. It's not the same person all the time. You know, it's not a recurring role. It's, you know, something that actually we would need a new mother for every life. You know, somebody to play that role. So all of you have been my mother. Every being has been my mother. I always think when I teach on that, I think of that Dr. Seuss book, Are You My Mother? I read it when I was a kid, where the little bird falls out of the nest and it goes to try to find, are you my mother? A Buddhist version would be like, yes, I was your mother 5 lifetimes ago. Anyway.
So I know one that helps me probably is very much directly very much related to 1 and 3, and that is just the holistic interdependence, that I can't have courage without fear, right? Mm-hmm. Right, I have to have both.
Right.
In order to...
Yeah, good. These are great additions to this list of, you know, things that if we hold that perspective, because the whole point behind this second topic that we're looking at of cultivating a new perspective is if we've lessened our fear, if that's been a prominent component of it, and then we change our perspective and how we're looking at the situation, then there's the ground to act accordingly. That's what we're going to look at next, is kind of what does it look like to act in response to what's going on in our world, whatever level. Because Buddhism, once more, does not put all the onus on the external world. We know that. Getting this all perfect on the outside isn't the goal, to, you know, have perfect samsara in a sense. Because samsara is fundamentally faulty. It's going to be always plagued by the delusions and karma that we're all, you know, dealing with. But it is an important thing to use then. It's the stuff from which we are able to actually grow and develop. In the same way that analogy of the lotus, that, you know, it grows from the muck in the pond, and it transcends that, rises above it, and completely flowers. But it needs the muck, it needs that stuff. So the external world is something we need to bring into our awareness and work with and be responsive towards. I think that Buddhism has really tried to, especially through Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been a great advocate of what's called socially engaged Buddhism, is not just sitting on your cushion and thinking, oh, I'm just going to fix my own little world and forget about the world around me, but rather recognizing that it's both. We work on ourselves so we can be better responsive to what's happening in the world around us. So any other shifts in perspective that will help you kind of get to that place? These were great. Okay, then let's go on to number 3. Specific advice on finding peace and courage, or even I could say here, acting from a place of peace and courage. So it's also important that we fearlessly act in accord with a more realistic perspective. And so what I'm going to do for this section is to look at some quotes from Buddhist teachers that, as I mentioned earlier, these were given just after the 2016 election. Lion's Roar magazine, which used to be Shambhala Sun, they sent out an email with all of this wonderful advice, a link to that at their website. And you can still find it out there, I think. This is advice that we'll use to explore various ways to find peace and courage in these times. So this is to set the preface for this, to kind of understand that this is a good Buddhist perspective to start with. Many of us have been practicing Buddhist teachings or walking a spiritual journey forever and preparing for this very moment of our existence. We are ready and have been waiting for this time. I heard this from a lot of Buddhists at the time, and I tried to give that message as best as I could when I was teaching in our Santa Fe Center after the election, was that this is what we've been practicing for, in a sense. Doesn't mean that we want it to happen, in a sense, but this is what we aim for, is to be able to deal with whatever challenges life throws at us and actually use it in a very productive way. So then this Zenju Earthland Manual, who's from, I love the name of the Zen Center, Still Breathing Zen Meditation Center. It's got 2 different meanings, right? Still breathing, still breathing. Anyway, he says, he or she, I don't know who, Earthland sounds like a woman's name, but I don't know why. I mean, it could be a man's. Our rage, pain, and anger are to be exposed, if only for us to transform and mature with it. I could say our fear, for that matter, too. In Buddhist practice, we say congratulations, because now is the time we have been practicing for. So, congratulations, It was like that. When I recounted what Venerable Rabina told me after, she saw me at the retreat after I'd fallen and gashed my face open. I said, oh, I had a fall the other morning. She said, oh, congratulations. Lucky you. What good fortune. So there's a number of topics that they touched on. And so what I've done is I've organized a few of the quotes to kind of highlight some of the points that I think will be useful for us to discuss for the remainder of time that we have here, which give us some of the tools to work with, having developed a different perspective and so on. First, on the importance of maintaining our Buddhist practice, to let this be a reminder for us to continue to do the work on the cushion in particular. This teacher, James Ishmael Ford, who I'm going to quote a number of times from the Boundless Way Zen group, says, so what to do? For me, I find a couple of things are critical. One is to not forget my practice, taking time and returning to the pillow. He uses pillow. I think he meant cushion. Pillow makes it sound like I'm going to bed. If I want to go, return to the pillow. I don't have a problem with that at all. For all sorts of reasons, but most of all to help me recall the fundamental matters of presence and intimacy. So this is kind of where it starts, is that I think we will be more in touch with how to respond to what's going on in the world if we do our practice. But our practice isn't, once more, about just sitting on our cushion and isolating ourselves from the whole world. It's to make us better prepared to be with the world. And then what we deal with in the world feeds back into what we do on our cushion. These are supposed to be interconnected practices, how we are in the world and how we are in our own individual practice. They're both absolutely relevant. So what does a daily practice look like to take the time to go to the cushion? I think that will vary from person to person, but I would encourage each of you, if you don't have a daily practice of some sort, to try to structure some time for more focused meditation. In Tibetan Buddhism, I've mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, we have 2 different types of meditation. One is that stabilizing meditation where we bring the mind as much as we can to a single point to reduce the distraction, to stop us from being monkey mind all over. Now, again, the distractions themselves will continue to arise. They'll continue to float through the mind. It's our staying put, being like teaching a dog to stay, right? You just keep doing stay, stay, stay until the dog stays. You just stay in that place where you're not following after all those things. like the monkey going from branch to branch. You're going to be able to just sit in a quieter state, recognizing those distractions will come and go, but they're not where you're going to choose to follow. Eventually the distractions will cease, and in this mind of calm abiding that we discussed earlier, they have ceased, where you can abide single-pointedly on a meditation object for as long as you wish. So having that as a daily practice is a really important part of our practice. But the second type of meditation, where we're doing analysis and thinking about the teachings, is equally important, and that's what we call our analytical meditation, which is really taking what you're learning and trying to noodle through it yourself. Because this is the challenge we face with Buddhism, is just to not take it on face value as this is what Don presented and what Lama Yeshe presented and whoever presented, and I trust them so it must be good stuff. It's like, no, you have to look at it and see if it's good stuff for you. This is what the Buddha even challenges us to do. So the analytical meditation has a variety of ways it's done. Sometimes it's just working with developing a particular quality, like compassion or loving kindness. That's an analytical meditation, where we are thinking about the suffering of others, feeling the empathy arise in our hearts, wishing to remove that suffering, and trying to stay in that place of compassion. But frequently it's also looking at things and trying to understand them. So even the teachings that I've done here, or that Venerable Tendrin does, it's useful to do reflection upon those points and see if they hold true for you. Or where are your questions, if you do have questions about the teachings? Those should come up in your analytical meditation. But then to try to work off of each of these. So you stabilize the mind first, perhaps using the breath, and then you start to entertain different thoughts about what you've learned, teachings that you've had, trying to dissect them, apply them to your life. When you get to a place where you feel like you're getting something, a bit of an aha moment, then you go back to the stabilizing meditation. You try to stabilize on that aha. Or for example, if you're working with compassion, when you feel that compassion very deeply, then just stay in the place of compassion. Don't create all the other thoughts about thinking of the suffering of others and all that. Just try to be in that space of compassion. So this is how we change our minds. But then you get up off the cushion imbued with more compassion or more understanding of karma or whatever it was that you were meditating on, and you live your life from that space of that understanding. And then you review your day at the end of the day and make a determination to do better than what you did in certain situations, to rejoice in the ways that you did do better than you used to do all that kind of feedback process, and then get up the next day and do the same thing. Engage in your meditation, your practice. That's in the simplest form. Many of you have a whole variety of other practices you do that are more complicated, that are rooted in the tantric tradition and so on. But the essence of a practice is to at least do those two things, to be able to focus the mind somewhat and then analyze the teachings. And then live from that space of whatever understanding you've developed. So, any questions on that? So all of the other things you do during your day can be influenced by that, as long as you take that time to practice and make it something constant, some continuity. Remember we talked about that on Thursday, that being an important factor in creating some power behind our merit, behind the positive things we're doing. So this also came up very common in much of the advice that was given, and we've already touched on it to some degree, so we may not spend quite as much time on this, but the subject of listening to the pain and suffering of others. This is a really important thing during these challenging times. As I mentioned earlier, we've been blind to some degree, or deaf perhaps, to the cries of suffering of many people in this country. It's not a competition. What we should be doing is being sure to open our hearts to the suffering of all beings. So James Ishmael Ford, who I just quoted, continued on later in his piece of advice. He said, one thing to do is to recall the suffering of the world. For me, this starts with those who are terrorized by the event of Trump's win, the immigrant, the person of color, the LGBTQ person, women, everyone who sees themselves as the target of Mr. Trump's campaign. So, to not deny that we have to look at that side of the equation, the people who are victim, if we want to put a label of victim on it, who are seeing themselves as potentially the recipients of the negative stuff that has occurred within our time, within this administration, for example. But then he goes on, and this is the important side of it, but also to recall the hurt and fear that led so many people to support him. To simply dismiss their emotions by cavalier, broad-stroke condemnations, while it feels good, and I do like doing that, he says, ultimately does no good. The Buddha was right in the great play of cause and effect we are all of us caught up in. This is really understanding once more. It's a huge interdependent thing that's going on. And so we have to be aware of the suffering of others who are acting in opposition to what our wishes are. If we voted in a particular way, other people voted the opposite, it doesn't mean that we totally dismiss them as all the words that can be used out in the public, of ignorant and whatever. This is not a helpful attitude to have. What's helpful is to hear the pain, the hurt that led people to do this, to acknowledge that, and to recognize that if we're dedicated to relieving the suffering of the world, then we're not going to be biased in that. We're going to have equanimity. We're going to want to make sure that we address the suffering of others. Now, of course, this is the whole gist of why the Buddha taught what he taught, was because people, although they don't want to suffer and want to be happy, aren't always going about it the best way. And one of the points that Arlie Hochschild, in that article I mentioned in the book Strangers in a Strange Land, she says, this is a group of people that tend to not vote in their best interests. And that's really sad that people who, and this is something that certainly many people have looked at in the phenomenon that happened in the 2016 election, is that a lot of the people who voted for him out of a desire that he would help them to relieve their hurt, their pain, their difficulty, are feeling the larger brunt of what he's doing in terms of it not affecting them in a positive way, but actually making their life more difficult. It's because frequently that is the case, is that they get, I don't know if duped is quite the right word, but get convinced by somebody that he actually has their interest in mind, and didn't. So we can feel great compassion for people in the space of that, the way they made decisions out of their own emotions and didn't necessarily look at all of the facts of it and be open to that, the suffering of others and wanting it to be relieved as well. They are a part of this country. When we go back to Rinpoche's comment about America will get the karma, the president, America has the karma to get, has the merit to get. Well, that's all of us collectively. That's not just the liberals or the Democrats or the Republicans or whoever. It's everyone collectively. So we have to be attentive to everyone, not just those that we see as potentially being hurt by what the administration's doing, but also those who voted for him, who did so out of their own concerns. Then another quote from a different teacher, Roshi Pat Enkyo Ohara from Village Sendo said, "And I realize how vital it is for all of us to listen to all the sounds of this unhappy nation. What suffering has led to the anger and hatred that has arisen? And why are so many of us surprised at this outpouring? Perhaps we have not been listening to the cries of the world with ears of wisdom and determination." This isn't to beat ourselves up and make us feel horrible that we, weren't doing this, but to recognize the potential we have to listen to the cries of the world, the cries of the other people of this country. So just another quote that emphasizes that idea, that I think this is an important way to maintain some sanity, to actually be very peaceful, courageous in the midst of what we see going on around us. To understand that there's suffering on both sides of the fence. Make some sense? Anyone have any other comments on that? Okay, let's go on to the third idea that was presented that I'd like to discuss a bit, and this is similar to this, but the subject of deepening our connection to others, not just having that understanding of their suffering, but really hoping to, kind of bring people together to create more harmony in this world. So let's look at the quote that goes with that. There's a few of them. This is from Athan Nichtern, who's from Shambhala Meditation Center of New York. "I also feel some optimism that this outcome sharpens and clarifies where humanity stands in the 21st century. All of us must come together with empathy and connection if we are going to survive this era." I have done a class on the environmental issues that the world is facing and a response to that, and I'm going to share a little bit of that as part of today through a book called Active Hope that's really quite optimistic around what can happen. But we are at a bit of a, I mean, don't want to sound so prophetic or something, because I guess this is true in many times in the world's history. But we are at a bit of a turning point. What has happened in terms of the expansion of so much in this world in such a short period of time leads us to this crisis that we are really facing of what does the future of this world look like? We can't just kind of stay isolated from everyone around us and think that somehow it's all going to be okay. What Joanna Macy in that book Active Hope called business as usual. This is one response that keeps happening in the world, as everybody just kind of keeps going with their blinders on just down the same pathway, not recognizing that there's another way that we could be working with what's going on. So this is part of, I think, what Ethan Nichtern is saying, is that we really are at a bit of a major point in our history of humanity on this planet. And it was quite amazing. There was a wonderful show that gave an appreciation for all that was involved in creating the world that we live in, called One Strange Rock. I don't know if any of you watched this show. It was on National Geographic. It was directed by Darren Aronofsky, who was a great film director, but he put together this thing. It was on the basis of 8 astronauts that had spent some time at the space station and had a view of Earth from that vantage point. And we're watching kind of what was all going on Earth. And so they would take some of the phenomena they observed and trace it back in terms of how air developed, air that we could breathe on this planet, and how, moisture and water developed, all these kind of things that we take for granted in our world that took, not eons, but definitely many billions of years to happen before man showed up. There's those calendars, right, of since the Earth was formed all the way to our current history, and we're in like the last few minutes of December 31st. There's a huge set of causes and conditions that preceded this. So here we are at a point where we've changed the world that we live in. We're in what they call the Anthropocene period, where it's man-centric. It's based on what humanity has done to this world. And so we need to take some responsibility for that. And it begins with kind of developing this connection to others in this world. Another quote on this topic is Reverend Andy Hoover, from Blue Mountain Lotus Society Sangha. He said, "The winner of the presidential election built his campaign on division. In our practice, we use the word separation. If our practice could be summarized in one sentence, it is this: we awaken to the oneness of all beings and act on it. That's what drives me in the work that I do." So I think it's at this time that we have to begin to generate a sense of connection, a sense of oneness with others, so that there isn't this separation or feeling like what happens in, Lake Charles County, Louisiana, or what happens in Syria, or what happens in places of the world that are being affected by climate change now, that's not us. There's a oneness to that we are all part of this creation that we call this world. That has all come about again through our own collective forces, our own collective karma. And we need to break down a lot of that sense of division. This calls for some pretty revolutionary thinking. It's going to come up a little bit in the next topic when we look at this idea of restoring hope and some of the concepts that, as I mentioned, Joanna Macy talks about. We have the potential for this. We were talking about earlier about the internet being a huge factor in increasing a lot of delusion in the world, but it's actually a great factor for increasing connection in the world. And I remember when I was growing up, everybody talked about how television had that capacity. Now look at television, and I guess it does connect people to some degree. But what we have in the internet is so much more capable of connecting people in terms of something that is worldwide and communication that can really transform, I think, and produce a much greater shift in consciousness, but we'll see. So the fourth one then is on this whole idea of restoring hope. So as I mentioned, hope is not a concept we talk a lot about in Buddhism either. And even when we use the term hope, it almost makes it sound like a sort of putting it all out there with some blind faith that it's going to happen. And that's not really what we would mean by hope. As I said, we're going to use this term active hope as a way of exploring this a little bit more. But I want to begin by sharing not something from the Buddhist teachers respond to the election, but rather from wonderful Jan Willis, I had the opportunity to meet her once. Have you ever had her here to teach? I don't know. She teaches for FPMT centers. You know Jan, have you met her? No.
I haven't met her, but I know she is.
Yeah.
We never had her.
Yeah, really wonderful teacher. She was a student of Lama Yeshe's and Lama Zopa's. She teaches at Wesleyan University, at least used to. I'm not sure if she's retired yet. She says in 1963, as a teenager, I had the good fortune of participating in the Birmingham campaign for civil rights led by Reverend King. It was a hopeful time when later, after leaders like Malcolm X, King, and the Kennedys had been struck down by violence, a period of hopelessness settled in. For many of us today, that hopelessness still seems to hold sway. So this was her talking earlier this year, January of this year. And I think that that is somewhat true. Again, the comments that were shared, earlier on speak to the fact that this can be something that becomes an influence on our lives, to feel like we're somewhat hopeless. What can we do in the face of all of this? And so, she says, before we endeavor to change the world, we need to rekindle hope again. The thing I've learned about hope, however, is that it grows from action, not from thought. If we wish to see an enlightened world of peace and justice for all, we have to move beyond merely imagining it to nonviolent actions, however small, that will help to usher it in. Yeah, I mean, it really is important. I mean, and I like this idea of however small. I mean, this doesn't mean that at every Washington March you have to go and be there. I mean, if you can go, how wonderful. But there's things you can do from your own apartment, your own room, and nothing is too small. It's all important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hope from the vantage point of the book I mentioned earlier, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Joanna Macy's environmental activist of sorts. I think she has a title for herself that I can never remember that is kind of giving a description of what she does. So this book is mostly about the climate change crisis that the world's facing. It was written a few years back, and when I first read it, I was really moved by the book. This man, Chris Johnston, contributed to it. But this is what they say. Whatever situation we face, we can choose our response. Does that sound familiar? Given that choice is something that we do have. When facing overwhelming challenges, we might feel that our actions don't count for much, yet the kind of responses we make and the degree to which we believe they count and are shaped by the way we think and feel about hope. The word hope has two different meanings. The first involves hopefulness, where our preferred outcome seems reasonably likely to happen. If we require this kind of hope before we commit ourselves to an action, our response gets blocked in areas where we don't rate our chances too high. So this is acknowledging that if we just have this investing in, we need it to be this, we need it to be, I hope it's that, I hope it comes out this way, then we're going to be very disappointed when it doesn't. So that's not quite the hope we're talking about here. The second meaning is about desire. It is this kind of hope that starts our journey, knowing what we hope for and what we'd like or love to take place. It is what we do with this hope that really makes a difference. So it's not going to be as invested in the final result as much as in the process of being committed to what it is that we want, that we desire in the world. If we want a world that's filled with loving kindness and compassion, then this is what will propel us on our journey. Passive hope is about waiting for external agencies to bring about what we desire, whereas what they call active hope is about becoming active participants in bringing about what we hope for. So she goes on in this passage to really delineate this differentiation between having this hope but then simply waiting for who knows who to come along and make that reality, versus this active hope where we are active participants in bringing about what we hope for. If we really want a world where climate change has ceased to be an issue, where we can actually go back, maybe not go back, but go to a place where things are more under control, where some of the factors will not continue to exacerbate suffering in this world, then we do that. Active hope is a practice, she says, like Tai Chi or gardening. It is something we do rather than have. It is a process we can apply to any situation, and it involves 3 steps. So I want to go through these because I think it's really important. We've got about 20 minutes, so I think I've got some time to do this. First, we take a clear view of reality. this is why, it's really emphasized that we do what we can to stay aware. I know it's very easy to kind of, turn off all the stimuli. I think that we don't want any media to come into our lives because we just don't want to take that all in. But we actually have to have this clear view of reality. We actually have to know what we're facing. It's really important to stay informed. I think in this day and age, and we are dealing with an administration that doesn't necessarily value and cherish reality in what's going on at a conventional level, and embrace facts that have been shown in terms of what's going on with climate change or with, human rights or with anything that's happening in this world, right? So we have to have that clear view of reality. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like things to move in or the values we'd like to see expressed. So this means, once more, in Buddhism we have this to some degree already. What are the sorts of things that we would like to ideally see in the world? And I'm not just talking about, all sentient beings enlightened. Well, that's a useful concept, but we're also talking about the conventional world we look at right now, that we are living in. What sorts of things inspire you? The direction we'd like to see for the world. For leaders to be able to come together and make agreement on how to continue to move forward in addressing some of the problems that we have in this world. Problems with refugees, problems with all kinds of stuff going on, not just climate change and these that we've identified. And then third, we individually take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction, which once more are whatever we can do. It's not going to look the same for every one of us. There's not like some criteria that we have to meet in order to be expressing that active hope, working from that place. So then she goes on to say, unlike that first definition of hope where she looked at and it kind of required, us to have the results in place in order for us to buy into it. Since it doesn't require our optimism, we can apply it even in areas where we feel hopeless. I think it's worth kind of thinking about that. We're applying active hope even in areas where we feel hopeless. We're going beyond the feeling of hopelessness to recognize that this is still what we're called upon to do. The guiding impetus, she says, is intention. We choose what we aim to bring about, act for, or express. So we get very clear on what our aspiration is for the world, having examined the nature of the world we live in, what it is that we're invested in, and we act on the basis of that. We in the face of whatever might be called hopelessness, I don't know if there's any real complete hopelessness, because everything is always going to be changeable to some degree, but we move forward, not being so caught up in the result needing to come about through that, but rather the process itself being a part of what we are doing, what we are acting from. I think this is why, to some degree, if we look at climate change, she did point that out as like one of the main factors that I think causes people to be in a hopeless situation is the immensity of it. It's huge. Mm-hmm. We're talking about an entire planet whose system is changing in terms of the gases and the heating, the temperature, all of this. So we're talking about huge factors involved. And it seems like, little old me, what can I do? But if little old me doesn't do anything, and there are 7 billion and plus little old me's here, nothing's going to get done. Mm-hmm. But when those 7.5 billion little old me's do something, even half of them do something, even a quarter of them do something, then there can be a huge shift. So it makes sense when we look at it in terms of climate change.
For that first sentence, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Hope doesn't require optimism.
Yeah.
Which I've always deeply believed. I could never form
Right.
the words for it.
Yeah.
It's brilliant,
Yeah.
actually.
But see, I don't know, to me it sounds like it does, not to get into a debate, but that whole hopefulness, there's an aspect of optimism in that to me.
I guess it's maybe, because I even talked earlier about optimism versus pessimism being a useful perspective. But I guess it's to what degree do we require an optimistic view in terms of especially the outcome? Because it goes back in my mind to that earlier slide where we said here, the first involves hopefulness, where our preferred outcome seems reasonably likely to happen. Where we kind of get we get so invested in needing the outcome that optimism around the outcome almost seems to be required. Whereas this doesn't require that optimism. This second type that is really what she defines as active hope. But it's still based on an optimistic
Yeah,
view. It's based on a view of moving towards
yeah,
what is positive.
Right, like, to me it sounds like, right, like it might not be blind optimism, but we need, hopefulness requires a level of positivity.
Yeah, so we might say positivity as opposed to maybe optimism. I don't know. Are they identical? But I agree with you. I think there has to be some,
Yeah,
because
but
we are
we
looking
need
at
to know
it.
we can make it better to be hopeful, and so we,
But
or
I guess need to make it better is once more sounding a little more goal oriented.
I didn't choose
But-
my words, but you know, like overall that,
Yeah. That what we are doing is a positive thing.
right, like
Yeah.
it sort of reminds me of Green Tara, right? Like it's taking action to
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
make a difference in the world that's beneficial.
Yeah. It's continuing to do what we do within the understanding that it's a positive thing to do. Whether it brings about the outcome that we need or not
Right.
is not as relevant as that we stay committed with our intention to doing that job, that positive thing in the world.
Right.
So there's a positivity to it, but maybe again, it's a splitting hairs perhaps
Yes,
in some of
definitely.
this.
It's not like to bring about, only why I say it's brilliant, I've experienced, you know,
Uh-huh.
you know, when, if you want things to get, or anybody, better, whatever their view is.
Right.
Okay, it means to reveal the truth. And sometimes sounding to others,
Right.
it doesn't sound optimistic. You know, because I've been criticized with this, you know, like, well, if you talk that way, you know, you're very
Nobody's going to listen
negative.
to you, yeah.
You know, and the truth, you know, sometimes is ugly.
Yeah.
You know, but if you
Yeah.
don't know that, how can you ever have hope?
Yeah.
That's what I got out of that.
Okay.
That's what
Well, let's go on to the next slide that also continues this thought. It says, rather than weighing our chances and proceeding only when we feel hopeful, we focus on our intention and let it be our guide. You know? Because it means then we're doing something. You know, we're not, yeah, it doesn't mean there's no wisdom involved at all. It means that we do it within the understanding of what needs to be done and what is being advised to continue the process, and then we focus on our attention, focus on staying on that path, committing to that. So then she says, future generations will look back at the time we are living in now. The kind of future they look from and the story they tell about our period will be shaped by choices we make in our lifetime. This is very true, right? You know, many people, we talked about children earlier, and you know, the children being kind of a strong motivator in regard to looking at this world and making choices about what we're doing in response to this government, in response to the refugee crisis, in response to, you know, the war in Syria, in response to any of these things that are happening in our world. And the future generations are the ones who will look back on this, and the story that they tell about our period is shaped by what we choose to do at this moment, how we choose to respond. The most telling choice of all may well be the story we live from and see ourselves participating in. It sets the context of our lives in a way that influences all other decisions. She spends a bit of time in the book talking about the story that we tell, and it just means, how are we framing this? How are we looking at what we are dealing with? Let me go through this real briefly. I mentioned the first one of these, but she discusses 3 stories of our time that are essentially 3 choices that we have. One is business as usual. Business as usual is, like I said, you keep the blinders on, you just keep doing what you're doing, and you think, oh, well, I can't, I'm just going to stay focused on my own little piece of the pie here, and let's just blindly hope that someone else is taking care of all that other reality. This business as usual hasn't gotten us very far, and I think a lot of people still buy into that story, that choice about how they're living their lives in regard to climate change, in regard to even what's happening with the government in this country, what's happening in the world at large. So this is not, I'm not trying to put value judgments on any of this, but this is one choice you have. You can do business as usual, right? and may be some advantages to you on a personal level for doing that, but that may be quite blind to the reality of interdependence and so on. The second view is a bit of a depressing one. The great unraveling, she uses this again in the context of the environment, but that we just see it as like we're all heading down the toilet, so let's just all be miserable heading down the toilet together in this world that's collapsing and falling apart. And it's a very dismal view of things, but it's a choice nonetheless to look at it and say, okay, this is the end of mankind on this planet, maybe there'll be a huge party when we're all gone, I don't know. I mean, that's one story that we could tell, one choice we could make. The third story is the story that she's proposing as the one that is really embodied with active hope, which is what she calls the Great Turning. And she has these wonderful ways of presenting it and going into even some stories that come from the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the story of the Shambhala warrior, that really embody how this is the time when we're called upon as those practicing this path of the bodhisattva, the warrior who wants to confront the suffering of the world, to actually rise to the forefront and make this part of a shift in consciousness, a real change in our world that we can all be a part of. I'm not out here advertising this as like I've got everything set up and I'll give you a little membership card and all that. That's not why I'm doing this. Just I feel like what she's done in this book, I really wish that this book would have been like everywhere in the world, everyone reading this, because I think it could be a really major instrument for changing things. What she details, I'm just going to go over this really briefly. If you are interested, I really encourage you to look at the book Active Hope that she wrote with Chris Johnston. The Great Turning itself involves 3 dimensions: holding actions, which are actually keeping us from doing more harm, right? Life-sustaining systems and practices. In the context of the environment, this means doing things that actually move in the opposite direction, help us to do more to embrace life. But these 2 ideas of refraining from what's negative and engaging in what's positive sound familiar? This you can see how she's very rooted in Buddhist thinking, is that we have to start there. Even we have that little prayer that's part of encapsulating the Buddha's teachings, right? Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Engage in only perfect virtuous actions. These are the first 2 steps, is that we have to stop doing what's harming. That means out on an individual level, stop doing things that exacerbate the suffering of the world. When we talk about the political situation, stop agitating people through doing things that aren't really productive, that only increase the anger in the world, that only inflame people in the world. And then start to do the things that sustain life and direction, connection, to try to be with others and support dialogue and movement in more positive directions. And then the final one is the third thing the Buddha teaches, right? Subdue your mind thoroughly. Shifts in consciousness. Move away from all of these perspectives that we were talking about earlier that were quite limiting. Just focused on the narrow perspective, the limited perspective of ourselves, only focusing on the moment and my well-being and comfort right now. And moving away from all of that to greater perspectives in terms of embracing the reality of the whole world. A shift in consciousness, it could be huge. Why do we not entertain this story? I'm just putting it out there in a general way. But I think it's a really powerful story that the more people that buy into this, that this actually, at this time in the history of this world, based on everything that's going on, all the various political forces that are happening, everything that's happening environmentally and so on, that this is actually a wonderful turning point. So she calls it the Great Turning of awareness and humanity towards something else, some greater awareness, some greater evolution, if you will. Why not?
Cowardice. People. First of all, this takes work, and it takes courage. And these things seem to be sorely lacking these days. I'm not quite certain why. I mean, it's not that long ago. I was just listening to a podcast last night about the year 1968,
right,
where the Kennedys were assassinated, MLK was assassinated, rioting all over the country, people dying all over. 15,000 soldiers died in Vietnam that year.
Yeah.
But it was also the year that man left planet Earth for the first time.
Right.
Apollo 8 circled the moon. Man left that boundary, that earthbound boundary. first time.
Right.
There was a lot of courage going on in that year, from all different places towards all different ends. It's pretty remarkable to think about it. So what's different right now?
And
Would be the-
I guess that is the question, but I also wonder to what extent does the story give us the courage? That's why I'm presenting it to some degree as well, is to acknowledge that I agree with you. It takes courage to move in that direction. But actually the story that we buy into about what we are dealing with now, about what this could be, and not again to get too goal-oriented, but to think about it in terms of the process of what it's like to move humanity to a different level of
But
awareness.
of course, the real interesting thing too is that the following year Richard Nixon became president of the United States.
Yeah. So here we are in the midst of, some pretty crazy times, some trying times. How are we going to frame this? How are we going to look at this time in our lives?
I mean, I remember His Holiness always saying,
Yeah.
that you to persevere, you must stand with your convictions.
Yeah,
And sometimes it means standing alone.
yeah,
Like if you're gonna wait for everybody, okay, I mean, I've sometimes had to stand alone,
Yeah.
For what I thought was good, not for bad,
Right,
but
definitely.
really, really check.
yeah,
And sometimes it's, it's not a fear like that, but you
mm,
sometimes can have a voice for others.
Sure, sure.
If you stand in a firm,
I think
I
so.
always remember His Holiness.
Yeah.
Stand, persevere
Yeah,
in your strong convictions towards compassion.
Yeah.
It's,
I agree. I think this is really important.
yeah.
Let's look at this next slide, because this goes back to what I was just saying in response to what you said, Ralph. Yeah. In choosing our story, we not only cast our vote of influence over the kind of world future generations inherit, but we also affect our own lives in the here and now. When we find a good story and fully give ourselves to it, that story can act through us, breathing new life into everything we do. It becomes the wellspring from which all the courage comes, all the determination comes. Our ability to stand alone or stand with others in this, will certainly be accentuated when we have bought into a good story, when the story that we are about is one that really is very positive in its nature. When we move in a direction that touches our heart, we add momentum of deeper purpose that makes us feel more alive. I got quite energized in reading what she had to share, and so I made my own commitment to trying to share it where I can, because I think it's a message that needs to get out there. I don't know what the next steps are always. I don't have everything, again, like some sort of master plan that I'm following. But I think that this is how it happens, is by people becoming more and more aware of the potential that this moment in time in our history, not this absolute moment, but this general period that we're going through, could actually be an amazing, opportunity for opening up to new dimensions of experience in this world and a real change in this world. A great story and a satisfying life share a vital element, a compelling plot that moves toward meaningful goals, where what is at stake is far greater than our personal gains and losses. The great turning is such a story. So there's a wonderful quote from Howard Zinn. Many of you may know him as the author of A People's History of the United States. He says, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and practices, and there are so many where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presence, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." So that's about all I have time for, because it's 4 o'clock. I had another little set of some quotes that had to do with the need for appropriate action. Maybe you can read these through. If you want to get a copy of the slides, let me know. Again, there's the sign-up sheet. maybe I'll just go through these real quickly. We have to act, there's no alternative, but what will our action look like? More hate, more blame and condemnations? Or can we genuinely recall there is in the last analysis no goal, but only the path? From James Ishmael Ford. And then another quote from Jan Wellis. Though we can sometimes envision a peaceful world, it becomes almost natural to see violence as inevitable and peace as impossible. But it is not. We know in our hearts that violence does not bring peace, that hatred breeds more hatred, and that only love and compassion can, only with love and compassion can hatred ever truly be appeased. This actually harkens back to a wonderful quote from the Dhammapada, where the Buddha essentially said the same thing, that this is the ancient and eternal truth, that hatred is only conquered by love. So, I'll again go jumping forward. Just go to the final thoughts. There's another little bit in there that's kind of interesting. Rita Gross, who was a Buddhist practitioner herself, she just died earlier this year, talks about kind of what Buddhism has to offer to activism, which I think is really useful to read. So again, you can take a look at that yourself. So this is a quote from Joan Halifax Roshi, who lives in Santa Fe as well, was the director of Upaya Zen Center. She's still involved with them, but no longer in that position. She says, so please stop and look deeply, and let's work together in not building a contentious future, but a generative one. And let's not pretend we know, but be open and learn. Let's bear witness to what is happening in our country, in our world, and take wise, compassionate, and courageous responsibility. So, I don't know, that's a nice quote. I don't know if I could say anything quite so eloquent, but... So, just to review what we did in this workshop today. This keeps going in and out, I don't know. I hope I didn't, by dropping a few times, that I haven't done some damage to it, but... So we first looked at this whole idea of fear, and fear being a potential obstacle in our lives, that if we do have that there, it's useful to take a look at that, deconstruct it, counteract it with some Buddhist understanding. And then secondly, this idea of how we can change our perspective, that coming out of understanding that we do have a particular way of framing the world that has a great influence on how we respond. And then lastly, some of these ideas that I think were useful from some of these Buddhist teachers that help us to reflect on the things that are most important to rely on during this time. And the fact that hope is a big one, engaging in our practice, these sorts of ideas. So I do hope that I've given you something to work with, some thoughts that will help you to find some courage and peace in these difficult times that we are facing. But to not let that be just the label that we give to it all the time, that in difficulty and problems and challenges, there actually is great opportunity. That there is something that can be amazing that comes out of all of this. It just comes down to each and every one of us, to make that commitment. So, good enough.
Thank you.
Okay. I hope it was of some use. I realized I was kind of throwing two different teachings together, but I think they worked well together. I don't know. Okay. All right, let's go to page 235, and we'll do the first two prayers this time. Again, with the same thoughts of dedicating for the welfare of all beings, and then recalling bodhicitta and how important it is that we continue to strengthen that mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha, and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then let's go forward to 244. We'll do the prayers for His Holiness and Lama Zopa to have good health and long lives. As we do this, we can think about all the spiritual guides that exist in our tradition and other traditions who are helping beings to find peace and happiness, making strong prayers for us and others to never be parted from such perfect guides. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And finally, just dedicate for those who you're holding in your heart right now. We always are thinking of all sentient beings, but it's useful for us to think about those whose situation moves us at this time. So maybe we have friends or individuals we've heard of who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died. Whatever their individual situation is, try to send this positive energy out so that it relieves their suffering, helps them to have all the causes of happiness. We can think about this in particular with John Morrell, who we had puja for last night, sending all this positive energy out so he can have a good rebirth, have all the good conditions he needs to become enlightened quickly. But anyone else we're holding in our heart, just send this positive energy out. May these beings find true peace and happiness. May all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here today. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's got a good picture.